just want to say a few things about T-Space and the program, and start by introducing myself briefly. I'm Irini Tsachelia. I'm a practicing architect and educator in New York, and I'm currently directing the residency program for T-Space. I've been instructing residents for the last 6 years now, since the beginning of the program, along with Stephen Hall and a series of incredible guest critics who have joined us over the years. This is the 3rd year the program is running online. We have a beautiful team, our coordinator, Marisa Espe, our host, Yasmina Pardo, who's here joining us today, helping with the webinar. Hi, Yasmina. Yasmina is also an architect practicing currently with Stephen Hall, architect. And for those who are new, the Stephen Myron Hall has initiated a T-Space, which is a non-profit organization focusing on the arts, education, design, and ecology, and its programming supports of the arts, art, architecture, poetry, and music. And it organizes the Services of the Arts events every summer. So just today, the new show by Erlene Shechet is open at T-Space, and on September 3rd, the new and final exhibition for this season is our pamphlet architecture show, which is coming up with Catty Dan Zhang, presently with other award winners for pamphlet architecture, and the ephemera for the show, talking about the history of pamphlet architecture, all coming together for that exhibition. So we're very grateful to hear from Catty about her participation, Active Atmospheres, shortly. And on Wednesday, we had a beautiful discussion with Bill Stout about books and their influences. And it's interesting to put all these things together, how Bill Stout was the publisher of pamphlet architecture for the very first 10 issues, and then it was taken over by the Princeton Architectural Press. So it's an interesting synergy of people and ideas coming together in our lecture series here. I'm very grateful for that. And to very briefly, the residency program is a 25-day intensive. It happens once a year, every July. And now we're in our 10th day. Our residents here, Yahya, Teresa, Isabella, Stephen, Jingwen, Lafina, welcome on the panel. They're producing extraordinary work in a very short period of time. And we're heading to our mid-presentation this week, and our final is coming up next Monday. So feel free to tune in. These presentations and guest critics will be available online. And one last note from my end, the scholarship programs that make this program possible, that make allow for the residents to join at no cost and make these resources available for the general public. So thank you very much, first of all, Steve Pullmuth, who's here on our panel, moderating the conversation today. Very generous support, enormously grateful for that. Along with Steve Pullmuth, Simon Scholarship, the J.M. Kaplan Fund, the Carpenter Scholarship, the Alhayat Scholarship, the Harvard Mile Parsons Scholarship, with additional support, very grateful to A.S. John and Jeffrey Brown, as well as Stan Allen. So thank you very much for those contributions and your participation. And I would like to invite everybody also to support the program. And you can see further details on the chat, how to do that very easily. So for our theme for 2022 for the residency is called Cosmic Dust, Space and Time. This is the themes that the residents are exploring. And with that, I will pass it on to Yasmin, our co-host, who can briefly describe the webinar structure before we start. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. Hello, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. I will quickly go through the structure. We have about 40 to 45 minutes of lecture by Catty. And thank you, Catty, again for accepting our invitation. It's a pleasure having you. After that, we will have approximately 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. Please make sure you engage in the conversation. And if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat while the lecture is happening. And thank you again. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Steve Polymut. Thank you so much, Steve, for being here to give a brief introduction on Catty and moderating the conversation. Thank you. The floor is yours, and very much excited for your presentation, Catty.
Excellent. Thank you, Yasmina. Thank you, Irini. Very excited to be here Sunday morning. Thanks for everybody tuning in. I know we have a really exciting presentation. My name is Steve Polymut, and I am on the board of the foundation, and it's a real thrill. It's actually the first time I've actually engaged in moderating a discussion. I was lucky enough to be on the property yesterday. I got to get a preview of the show that's just opened. It's glorious. Very excited for all of you to physically visit in the near future. And I can't express my enthusiasm enough for all the great work that's being done by the team. And I've been a visitor to the foundation for over a decade, and I've just watched it grow and grow. And I'm very excited to learn about all of you and all of your individual works and stages of the careers that you're pursuing and all the diverse backgrounds. I myself am an art historian by training. I've worn many different hats over the years. Often the joke now is I've done everything except for make the art. But I'm an art historian. I studied at Columbia. I was very lucky to work with Rosalind Krauss and Benjamin Buchloh. So I spent time in the October sort of circle just as a student, and then I ended up after college, I ended up in England, where I did my doctoral research in art history, where I actually worked on Renaissance drawing. And so that's sort of the breadth of my interest from modern to Renaissance. And then for a number of years, I operated a space. So, the curatorial muscle, I had a space on Orchard Street, which was a really exciting time for me. And these days, I'm semi-retired, let's say, early stages of a different phase, and I'm engaged with the foundation. I also am on the board of the museum where I grew up in Baltimore, which is a really extraordinary museum. I wonder if anyone's ever visited. If you haven't, highly recommended. It's an encyclopedic institution. We have the world's largest Matisse collection, among other things, which is very interesting. We've just built a research center there, and the board is very active. We have a Joan Mitchell retrospective that's up right now that is going to be traveling to the Louis Vuitton Foundation at its next venue, but it'll be in Baltimore for another month in case anyone's passing through that area. And yes, so very engaged with them. I'm chair of the Contemporary Accessions Committee there, so still very involved in contemporary art. I split my time between New York and Maryland both. And I'm zooming in from Ghent, which is not that far from Rhinebeck and from the foundation. So really a thrill to be upstate with a few of us that are up here. And I'm very excited for our talk. I've not met Catty in person, but we have had quite a wonderful series of dialogues over the last couple of months. I served on the jury for the pamphlet 37, and with a very esteemed group of art historians, architectural historians, architects. It was Irini. It was an amazing experience. I had never been on the jury before, and I have to say, now I can say it, Catty's proposal came right to the top, and it was a very stiff competition, as you can imagine. There were proposals from all over the world. It's an anonymous process, and so it's really kind of amazing to now get to know, the mind behind the ideas. And so Catty is an assistant professor at UNC Charlotte. She's the founder of Temporary Office, which is a design and research firm exploring architecture and digital technology. She has exhibited in multiple institutions throughout the country and the world, including the Carnegie, the London Design Festival, Harvard GSD, among others. She was awarded the first prize officially earlier this year for pamphlet 37. We're very excited. The title of her pamphlet is Active Atmospheres on Instruments and Protocols for Medium Hybrids and Architectural Voids. She earned her BArch from, I can't pronounce it, Cathy, you'll have to help me, but from Tsinghua University. I gave it a shot. Her MArch with honors from Washington University in St. Louis, and a Master's in Design Technology from Harvard Graduate School of Design. And today we will be hearing from her, and then we'll have a nice conversation afterwards. Looking forward to it. Thank you, Cathy.
Okay, thank you so much, Stephen, for the introduction. Let me first start sharing my screen, making sure everything is going. All right. Okay. Okay, and thanks again for the introduction, and thank you to the T-Space for inviting me. It's a real honor to be part of this year's lecture series. I'm really looking forward, as Steve was talking about, the upcoming pamphlet architecture exhibition, and as well as the final kind of the publication that will capture some of the work that I will talk about today in a more kind of in-depth way through the lecture. So with the video showing a group of blue people running through pink smoke, and with the title of the lecture, I will start to get into the topic of today. So architecture, despite throughout its longest documented history, has been generally conceived as permanent, fixed, stable, and etc., is also increasingly being considered as dynamic conditions that constantly adapt, react, and mutate. And with these as a general background, my lecture today will try to conceptualize the diffusion and togetherness in architecture, and I will talk about it through experimental work that explore relationships of a human to human, human to mediums, mediums to non-human, and non-human to spaces, and etc. Going to the next slide. Oops. Am I still here? Wait, let's see. Okay, here we go. So the work relate loosely to a pair of themes, and there are shared screens and shared air. And I will showcase a series of recent projects that tries to rediscover architectural concepts of the edge, the void, and the partition. Overall, the work of temporary office, which is the practice I'm running, builds upon the framework that consists of two core elements. One is the medium hybrids, which include atmospheric mediums that are particles in the air, and computational mediums such as pixels in raster image, or a hybrid anywhere in between of the two. And the other is visual techniques, including physical and mechatronic optics, from analog visualization or optical lenses to various forms of computational processes. And the integration of the mediums and optics in their different forms set the foundation for my design research that foreground atmospheres as active systems in architectural production, with the projects I'm presenting today ranging from responsive environments more to these kind of analog and physical side towards also multimedia explorations and extended reality. In the form that we are communicating like these in the virtual space right now, I'm going to start talking about the first series of projects by showing these pair of rendered scenarios. And on the right side is a typical view that I believe many of you are seeing in front of yourself right now. And on the left is how you are being seen by others at the same time through your webcam. And the only difference is probably the small orange piece set in motion, transforming the amount of visible area in the camera view in these rendered animations. And the small piece is very important here. The size and proximity to the optical lens of the webcam introduced a room that is only to be perceived through the camera, a temporary foreground that mediates between the flat screens and the viewers. As our personal spaces nowadays increasingly becoming the limited area in front of webcams, presented through teleconferencing platforms and grids on digital monitors in many other spaces at once, the concept of rooms or domestic spaces, which are traditionally understood as areas defined by walls or barriers within reachable proximities, are thus perceived as networks of framed camera views. Their static spatial outlines dissolve into fuzzy boundaries that dynamically recompose themselves at virtual distances in real time. Also, as part of these is the increasing concerns of personal privacy, showing on these slides a series of images, a piece of whatever material cut and positioned carefully or randomly, such as the very last image here with the duct tape, has been a daily culture for quite some time. But it was not until the early 2020 that our interaction with these temporary and informal lens covers became more aware in many people's daily life due to the demands of participating frequently in virtual meetings with video on and function as such, as a result of pivoting to the remote work situation. And this is a set of drawings produced with these type of cultural phenomenon using the webcam. And here, the ordinary action sequences around the webcam, such as peeling off the tape, covering the lens, adjusting light, and moving hands between those objects while getting ready for video calls, are reassembled into surreal scenarios interactively using real-time video captures. So the temporary foreground room that I mentioned earlier with a small piece in motion from the camera and in front of the camera leads to some really interesting and extreme results. In some cases, here are a couple of abstract color patterns generated with hand waving very close to the camera, and it fluctuates the digital canvas with hues of reds and grays and pinks and greens, so on and so forth. So they're in fact drawings with artificial light intensity. And for some years, I have been researching into very sophisticated and mechanically sound camera systems for producing imageries of space, time, and movement. Chronophotography as an example, or slit scans as some of the methodological references in this type of work. While the chronophotographs challenge the finite space for recording legibly the discrete frames in the motion sequences, slit scan is not only a spatial method, but also as signifiers of the temporal relations, with lines being recorded at different times, collectively composed into a final image. So in this project, we built drawing apparatus that establish this kind of analytical relationship between camera apparatus and pixel arrays, and to translate the chemical mechanical methods of local motion studies into pixel-based operations. So the piece of material covering the camera lens and the action sequences to open and to close it become an act of animating the slit scan mechanisms. And I was referring to the very right-hand side, the camera photo, the masking component over the negative film. So real-time video captures are stored temporarily in this case, and the still frames selected at certain intervals and from the constantly updating sequences in motion and outputted onto layered polygon shapes with remapped UV coordinates. So this is essentially an exercise of a spatial temporal mapping. So here are some examples we're seeing from the results where fictional forms emerge autonomously from the overlay of the current frame and the previous stored frames in the video feed. The webcam drawings are essentially instrument of image and time. Visual orders is created from rearranged relations or reassigned properties of the pixel arrays from the camera capture computationally. So this is essentially an expanding taxonomy with where we're seeing blocks of color appear as distorted doors and openings, masking tapes partially over the lens that creates what textures and et cetera, by indexing the parameters of size and sequence and interval and et cetera. So these experiments were initially developed during the lockdown, during the, since mid-March in 2020, to put forward a critique to the pandemic disruptions. So we see the normal connection between in typical kind of times, between the domestic and public spaces has been defined by the capability and the means of relocating oneself physically from one place to another. So this set of drawing interrogate the physical boundaries of the isolated personal spaces by trying to overlap two types of camera spaces, one of which is evidenced in the photos captured at various locations in the city, and the other is kind of dynamically related to individuals within their personal spaces. So we're seeing translucent veils, gradient reflections, tinted roof shingles, and etc. The digital materiality constructed through the interactively altering pixel intensity and the image frame density. And for instance, hand movement at times will trigger wrinkle effect on building facade. And as a result, the personal messages reclaim the public space through the screen interfaces, and the portable devices here become tools for virtual placemaking. Last year, we had an opportunity to propose a temporary installation for the Discovery Place, a science museum in Charlotte, North Carolina. And we took this investigation further to explore 7 different urban locations as part of constructing these related camera and screen spaces and the cohabitation of digital images, and develop these into a physical environment. This installation is designed around 3 components, showing on this page a series of suspended cameras in the sketch, as the spheres with coils, and humans who interact with these cameras as a set of scaled cultural objects. In this case, imagine as folded sticky notes or great paper patterns, and they function as spatial instrument and as color inputs for cameras to see and to capture and to process. And together they produce views within the installation to be captured in motion. And here are some of the early studies of the physical arrangement, including human habitation and the virtual animation to be overlaid as part of the space in real time. Color and geometric patterns are both habitable and visually transformable in this case. And early video sketches here are the 2 of the selected kind of locations, showing ways of transforming real photos into 3-dimensional screens to be explored from outside and from within. And the projections are generated by visitors in the space and then mapped onto 3D forms. And the method of translation from the 2D to 3D and from image to form led to the design of these initial set of 7 projection chambers. And here's a series of study model we put together, and we ran some of the texture map projection mapping test over these study models, showing in some of these pictures the projection scenario documented as part of some real-time interactions. And the 7 locations we select have very diverse identity to the city of Charlotte. The design of these 3D chambers essentially hybridize the real and altered imagery to provide a sense of familiarity as well as a sense of playfulness. The actual installation designed for the museum space eventually kind of integrate the 7 habitable projection screens as part of the standing along box, where the interactive imagery create a soft edge of the space to be looked at and looked into at the same time. And this is a half-inch physical model where you're seeing temporary walls and the soft edge of the projection chambers subdividing the gallery into several smaller rooms. And it invites kind of various form of visual interactions with each other and with their own altered image on architectural surfaces. And also you're seeing some of the kind of the translucent suspended spheres, and we're imagining those as webcams to be interacted by people. They are right now kind of, presented as connected to Silver Springs and wired to the control system that essentially will instruct the projection output. And we envision the camera being a huggable piece, as showing in some of these watercolor sketches, where one might hold it and pet it or talk to it or being with each other around it. So eventually these kind of object has and provide a way of human to human interaction and human interactions to devices. And in another version here, we're imagining the integration. Actually, this is the full-scale prototype where the LCD screens are integrated as part. So the camera, you can see my cursor here on the lower side of the screen, facing at an angle towards the kind of the lower portion of the environment, will capture and mirror the image onto the screen. So as we're standing in front of the screen here, documenting the piece, it start to kind of generate intuitive reactions where people start to exploring their body movement. Or it would become some sort of a silent camera conversations or camera battles between the two. And these two kind of views were not planned. We were taking some documentation of the physical prototype, and our team started to kind of improvise as they try to align the captured views to the small screen. So in terms of the full-scale construction, on one hand, it is about optimizing material and fabrication workflow using various machine settings, but also it is about the material effect produced through the camera drawing instruments, as showing in some of the captured frames on the right side of the slides. And the material samples we made, we're looking at different ways and speed of carving and the width of the lines and etc. And here is one of the full-scale chambers we've been building throughout the past couple of months. As you can tell, we worked through various scales throughout the design process, and we have also been iterating our color schemes based on a series of really comprehensive decision-making process. And this is another chamber in orange. So they're really kind of 3D line drawings designed for the shared perception of human and the camera. And the video is the actual captured views and layered with a computed visual effect in real time. And the physical material and virtual imagery eventually blur the edge of the space defined by architectural surfaces, where animations are co-authored by human emotion and the camera movements. So as the previous project is about relating camera spaces and redefining the architectural edge, this project Lens was designed as a site-specific immersive exhibition relating air movement at separate locations using responsive technologies. A canopy of umbrellas, upside-down umbrellas, produce a rain of air puffs where we kind of we translate the data collected from weather API through internet, combining real-time wind velocity to turn that into a colored droplet of air effect. So the site for such investigation is essentially in the void spaces between the naked human eye and the visible forms of the built environment, a space as less dense mass filled with materials in scientific terms, as described in some of the meteorological approach by Filmmaker, and a couple of lines from his book Form and Function Follow Climate. He writes, space from this point on is no longer imagined simply as void, as an absence defined by walls, floor, and ceiling, but as less dense mass, disconnected, transparent, and yet nevertheless filled with materials. A void invisible to the eye, certainly, but in which the body was immersed. And it's at the same time a space that is filled with imaginary and philosophical mediums. As Da Vinci claimed in his notebook, the visual function of clouds, that they are useful just as angels and birds in filling gaps around figures, or as the analogy Marina Warner made between atmospheric forces around shapes of air and the spirit stamping out of human body. And Vance is a part of a series of work exploring the moving air systems and the form, sequence, and rhythm of the airflow as the spatial potential at various scales. So in these works, so instead of treating the air in the void as a separate matter on its own, the project also foreground the coupling of air forms being produced and the design of the machinery simultaneously. So each unit in this installation assembles a pair of kinetic air chambers onto modified umbrella structures. And we look at the way of generating a specific form of air, which is the vortex ring one can feel when they collapse onto skin. It's a topological form of airflow nowadays being really widely used in both art installations as well as in the gaming industry due to the kind of the visual and tactile properties. So we script the pressure input through a plastic membrane into each of the air chamber, and that result into the formation, the movement, and the morphing patterns of these rings. The visual, audio, and tactile output from those rings and the mechanisms in operation, such as motor sound, are synthesized into a multisensorial experience in the gallery. And we construct these mechanisms from ready-made products, such as the plastic jugs, and we customize connection joints for each piece to come together. There's such as an overview of the production process and the different components. The way they were designed allowed both for the path to come into the chambers through the arm of the jug, as well as the electronic system for light and motors to be integrated as part. As much as it was about creating the effect with airflow, it was equally important for us to articulate the piece as a spatial elements that provide an architectural function. These suspended new ceiling aligned at the bottom of the foyer of the gallery at 8 feet above the floor, which was designed to alter the perceptual dimension of the gallery. And here is kind of some of the installation process showing cable management and lighting tests and the assembly to the suspended integrated frame in each piece by piece. The installation was designed for a group exhibition I curated at the time. The work on display here was designed with a layout on the floor using digital monitors and large format prints, and they follow a 3x3 grids. These vertical, the thin black lines you're seeing dropping from the ceiling, from the suspended ceiling, they are both functioning as path for the fogs to move upwards to the connected kind of network of the tubes and to the outlet. And at the same time, they function as spatial registers where the 3x3 grids of the exhibition layout start to rotate and distort around each of the intersection points. And by doing so, the new irregular pathway of viewing the exhibition were defined. So it also creates some of the surprising alignment that's showing in this video, where the monitor start to illuminate light from the video on display and portraying the volume of fog falling from above. And the fog rings occasionally also collide onto the screens. And each of the fog rings, they transform and enlarge as they fall downwards to the floor and become soft columns in space at times. These kind of forms fluctuates along according to the subtle forces that is caused by the movement and activities in the exhibition. And here we're seeing some of the playful interactions of the visitor having with some of these rings. So first, the sound will be generated from the motor triggering the kinetic chamber, and the light will fluctuate along according to the data inputs. So this is one of the typical kind of reaction we notice, is that people attempt to touch and to grab these rings very gently while they pass by someone with close proximity. And the result of these playful interaction leads to various ways of rediscovering spectatorship in the contemporary architectural kind of exhibition settings, where the encounter with fog rings, from seeing to trying to touch to moving around and discovering different works on display, triggering new sequence of events and choreograph the human movement based on the synergy of the visual media on display and the responsive atmosphere. And some of the findings of the physical medium, with the physical medium of air forms and machineries, leads to the articulation of form and rhythm of flow in a series of kind of computational explorations. And this was also part of the result of transitioning to the remote situation. And I start to reflect upon some of the theoretical framework and methodology of generating parametrically various expanded kind of potentials of forms of air. Part of these was kind of operating with various animated rigid objects and collision relationships with digital air. And another way we were exploring in a similar way is kind of using computational setup that turn blob of geometries, which are rendered invisible here, into volumes of into volumes filled with air currents. And the actual medium virtualize themselves. They keep their physics properties in terms of their, their viscosity, for instance, in the flow and the gravity. And we run through that through physics simulation engines, where the digital geometries such as the mesh, the curve, and their geometric attributes were translated into forces and eventually activate and modulate the particle movement. So the study result in the categorized condition that could be seen as volumes or boundaries within soft edge, with soft edge and various density. And it could be at times perceived as separate volumes or stretch into a thin and dense enough amorphous kind of edge condition. So they interrupt the homogeneous void dynamically and partition the space in a way, and become interplay of the rigid and the amorphous and the sealed and the porous. So we took these as a forensic visualization tool, and we used the kind of the air and particle as spatial and sensorial measures in exploring an industrial transformation during the COVID outbreak, which I will show in the third series of work. So we were trying to use the visualization tool to manifest a shifted perception of the shared atmosphere through computational techniques and visual phenomena. So we take the meat processing industry as a context of study, and to explore the kind of the boundary and partition conditions. On this slide is a super interesting kind of pair of examples. In 1969, Hans Hollin's project, Mobile Office, showing on the left, explored the social and architectural possibilities brought on by advancement of new technologies, with these performances taking place within an environmentally enclosed but visually permeable boundary. And on the right side, in 2020, meat processing facilities installed temporary dividers, complying to the CDC guidance on processing and preparing workplace for COVID-19, a measure related to what we have understood now as socially distanced. And they protect oneself from within the shared air. So the big box and subdivided temporary barriers versus the visually transparent but sealed weather. And here I would also like to quote from Timothy Patriat in his book, Every 12 Seconds, where he talks about the slaughterhouse is not a single place at all. Its internal divisions create physical, linguistic, and phenomenological walls that often feel every bit as rigid as those marking off the exterior of the slaughterhouse from the outside world. We constructed two types of atmospheric instrument to simulate the motion sculpted air forms. And this is the first type, which built upon the interactions between particle blobs and the inhabitants, such as the machine or the animals. Motion path, bounding geometries, and surface normal vectors of moving objects were translated into force parameters. The activated current of particles fluctuate along the fused path of motion and aggregated within the connected void spaces. And they become dynamic partitions that interrupt the initially homogeneous volumes of air. Here is a series of studies of connected spaces throughout the processing facilities that involve human, machine, and livestock in motion. And we studied and kind of visualized these using these atmospheric instruments. And these are a few, essentially they're hybrid drawing. They kind of combine the orthographic views of typical architectural drawings with the animated conditions of the shrinkage of particle blocks and the actuation and collision of the currents of the particles in the killing and processing rooms. And so we see these not only as a project that visualize the air partitioning space, but also we're taking these as a social inquiry. And we're exploring using web-based VR platform to try to explore the industrial phenomena perceived and received by the viewer. So we kind of probed these industrial kind of phenomena during these health and safety crises with human and machine labor inhabited within, and designed a virtual staging condition where the three studied areas of the simulated particle blobs are anchors of the first play of the lower level of the space, where you see these kind of in these views, the vertical chimney and two connected pair of spaces towards each side. And the curved volume on the second level house the virtual archive of the research outcome, intersecting with and subtract from one of the stage particle areas. The viewing axis is established to stage the various forms of media on display on the upper level. And this is a detailed view of the staging of the robotic cutting, the view of the robot arm at rest, and on the upper corner, the drone view from above of the chimney, and the simulated cutting path that turns the view, the vertical opening into a horizontal viewing axis, to be then layered with the virtually immersive particle simulation during the cutting operation performed by the robot. At the same time, we explore the architectural materiality in reaction to these type of particle events. The rigid grid, which showing in this kind of designed scenarios as the virtual material texture, then dripped into soft forms, signifying the instability of the invisible space. And here is a pair of views of the bubbling floor, the left looking from above and the right one looking from within the space. And another one showing the failing of the edge of the chimney. Again, the side view as well as on the right looking from below. And the drapery ceiling in between the killing and processing staging area. And another one, the swelling walls and floors. Here, kind of reacting virtually to the particle emerging and fluctuating in the adjacent spaces. So these conditions situate between the three processing areas, and the material effects afford the transition between the perception modes, which range from the immersive with particle simulation blob simulations to the deformation of the rigid surfaces. This is a sneak peek of the web interface, partially the web interface from the main space. We're launching these at a later date, planned to be in the fall of this year. And this is another kind of main perspective view of the space, capturing the entry towards the killing room and the staged robot arm area. As part of this research, we categorized publicly available data and case studies to identify the programmatic and environmental adjacencies of volumes of air, as well as the motion trajectories that the machinery follows to move animal products during different kind of stages of the processing assembly. So here is kind of a categorization. We marked out the movement pathways and the program kind of sequences in adjacent relationships to a series of spaces. And just like the early mechanization of the industry resulted in the segmented parts for each specific task along the assembly lines to be clustered together and aggregated due to the productivity needs. In the age of automation and intelligence, the production facilities in these invisible void around the temporary dividers encompass highly repetitive activities involving products moving at certain constant paces, machines executing programmed motion sequences, and workers performing limited set of predictable operations. And these all leads to the quantifiable time and motion effect, just as what Frank Gilbreth showed in his scientific method with optical techniques in 1914. And so in the second part of the project, we imagined the forms of invisible particles modulated by the determinacy of motion sets and the informality of temporary dividers in the meat processing industry instigated by the COVID-19 pandemic. And here are some of selected frames from rendered simulation studying a robotic rib cutting scenario. And the second type of atmospheric instrument of this project translate motion extracted from the video clips into non-rendered geometry using computer vision algorithms, which is then interacting with planes of digital air. And the resultant flow patterns showcase the choreographed spatial impact created by human and machine movements. And this is a series of, a series of views which abstractly expose the hybrid realities of the internal organization abstractly with kind of, drawings and lines and path of the contemporary food production system where the laborers occupy. And here the dynamic interactions between particles and temporary shields become measured instruments, revealing the labor effect on architectural spaces. So to take a potential connection to the virtual residency project and to transition towards concluding my talk, I wanted to return to the mediums and optics framework with a very small piece that I did a few years ago. It is a portable optical device to be weared on one's head and allowing a person to see the movement of hot air with naked human eye. The device utilizes a pair of parabolic mirrors to visualize flow of air based on optical principles, which is known as lateral optics. And it's in this particular version, it detects the subtle changes of the density of air caused by convection activities due to temperature difference in the atmosphere. So if you're following the James Webb telescope, or if you're interested in the telescope kind of in general, you're probably familiar with the principle of the parabolic mirror, which takes the light ray from twice of the focal length and reflect back exactly on the point. So the subtle bending of light in this case serves as role of increasing the contrast in the field of view. So this is kind of a to be perceived at the exact point only. So each eye will see from one mirror a small area of hot air. So in this view, you're seeing kind of, this is captured by a single camera. So on the right lens, you're seeing the round area, circular area with hot air patterns. On the left, you only see the candle. So this is kind of a contrast of the visible and the invisible kind of patterns of flow of hot air. So with this function, the instrument actually impacts how one moves around with awareness of surrounding air movements. So these videos are documentation from a test I did when I was wearing this piece and I was walking around on a non-windy day, where the visible air movements here, although would be considered static or unnoticeable otherwise, were in fact much more drastic than my speed of walking. And here also, with the overlay of the background of the actual movement and the in between of the actual movement and your eye, the visualized hot air pattern, the instrument then become from the optical instrument to a temporal instrument that signifies the sense of motion and makes aware of the perception of time. Diffusion is a process, to conclude here, a result of activation, a durational atmospheric logic transformed into spatial potentialities. So with these, I will leave it here, and I think we can take some questions if there are any.
Great, thank you, Cathy. It was extraordinary. Lots of amazing things to think about. Beautiful imaging as well. My God, there's a lot of incredible projects. Obviously, there's so many multifarious aspects of your work, exhibition making and apparatus and theory. Yeah, let's have some questions maybe to start, or should we engage directly into a conversation? I have 1,000 questions, but I don't want to take up all the airspace. I guess I'll start with a question, which is maybe sort of background. Your relationship to the digital. It's something that I find very interesting now, looking at architecture and architectural exhibition making. Was the digital part of your kind of foundational education? Like, when did you start working with this kind of logic, this kind of visual logic? Just curious, has that always been a through line throughout your area of research and interest, or was that something that came later? Curious about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think in terms of the actual techniques, that was fairly recent, in probably the last, say, 7 years, which if we consider that as recent. But I think it builds upon kind of the interest through an architectural logic, which is essentially, maybe referencing cinematic logics, or how one is set in motion as an animator of spaces, as Corbu said, the space is to be explored on one's feet, right? So, or as Juliana Buno talks about, architectural surface and material and media to be explored with an embodiment. So I think those serve a lot of the theoretical grounds for some of the digital approach. So this investigation of both kind of, the atmospheric medium in terms of the flow is trying in one way to capture the transient experience, both from the animator as a human, but also the animated kind of medium. So the duality of the two coupling together. And some of the other part, which is more related to the dynamic imagery, is I think in the same logic of how you perceive motion, how you generate motion, how you capture and store, and how you operate along the temporal dimension. I think the techniques comes as part, not on that technology itself, but part of the architectural interests serve as the ground.
It's very interesting because I'm actually, there were several times in your presentation where I was thinking about when you showed an image of that generation of early photographers, Muybridge, Marais. There were a whole series of these early experiments in chronophotography, that kind of logic. It's very interesting to look at that, consider that, the struggles that they had to try to capture motion, and, for example, digital imaging of airspace, which is obviously a very, big, challenging topic in the COVID kind of climate that we're all a part of. And I think that it's interesting that we're kind of struggling the same way that those early pioneers were in terms of trying to harness our technology to tackle these very nebulous questions of the airspace that we occupy, that we all occupy, that architecture, essentially has, to grapple with as we move into a post-COVID era. And I think that's also very interesting. And so, yeah, I guess my other question is, straight up, was airspace? Let's, I'm going to come back to that a few times. Was airspace a kind of an interest? How did that start? I mean, I was obviously, one of the great, kind of prime subjects of your pamphlet winning proposal, and it's interesting to see how you've clearly been investigating these questions long before COVID. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And
I think
it's very interesting.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's probably officially started with the last piece I showed, where I was wearing the pair of lens and seeing the flow, and started to really kind of looking at impact. So it's less, it's a huge effort kind of, putting that together, because it's so kind of precise optics, right? So, but other than that, I think it's more important to really evaluate and observe and reflect upon what the impact it was. So as I was talking about, in impact, the sense of motion and sense of speed and sense of time. So that comes to a series of kind of more in-depth investigation with the analog form of air, using kind of different ways to visualize the form of heat, for instance. So one project I didn't show today, due to kind of based on the interest of time, is essentially a set of robotic devices, and then to produce the thermal curvatures to sculpt the form of air. So there has been a series of kind of different scale and different techniques investigated to really try to unveil the impact and look into, through articulating their behavior and the properties and materiality attributes, to probe other set of questions. So that was kind of, I would say, maybe during 2016 to maybe 18, or even later than that. And after that, I started to kind of explore different tools and different kind of ways of using that as a measuring tool for an expandable set of applications, such as evaluating kind of architectural spaces and etc.
Interesting. And
I would like to ask a
Yes.
question.
Hi, Stephen.
Please.
I would like to ask a question. Do you envision there will be a post-digital condition? In other words, I think that, let's say that the paperless studio at Columbia University in the 90s, and people like Hani Rashid, who only worked in virtual space, did the whole virtual Guggenheim thing. We all forget about all that stuff, but that was then. And I'm attracted to everything in your work that I would call post-digital. So I would like to point out my two favorite things. One is this amazing image of this pink circle, like a donut, throwing a cobalt blue shadow. Could you bring that up on the screen? Could you bring that up on the screen?
Let me just 1 second.
I just think that was incredibly original work. I've never seen anything like it. And I think there's a painterly quality and a sculptural and architectonic quality that doesn't have anything really to do with, virtual reality or all these other things. In other words, this series of images on the right, I think, the cobalt blue shadow, the idea that these blocks of air are throwing these cobalt blue shadows. I mean, and the composition, the simplicity of the composition. By the way, I think you should try to show fewer images on your screen. When you put so many, especially when we only have these little these little iPads. If you could just put one image on the screen, it's much better. And I thought that, and then my second most exciting thing was your glasses. Could you go back to that? Your first image of the glasses and the device that can see the thermal action. This is beautiful. Oh yeah, this is so beautiful. A big black screen and two circles, which tie back to your conceptual beginning. Sometimes when we want to, let's say, allude to the intuitive and the poetic and the immeasurable, we don't want to explain everything, right? Because nothing that's really exciting, like Brock said, everything that's really exciting about painting, everything that's really exciting about art, you really can't explain. And I think Brock was a great painter and a great human being. But then there's an image right after this where you can see the device that you built it and used it. Yeah, that's fantastic. This is a great page in your presentation. First, you have this feeling of an architect because there's a projected axonometric of this device, right? Then you have the physics of the lens, and then the image. I guess is that the actual object in the lower left corner?
Yes.
So what year did you make this?
That was 2016, I believe. Yes.
All right. I think this is your breakthrough project. I think this is really strong. As you see, I think as architects, we have to bridge the gap of all the gaps, right? We have to be able to compose composition. We have to understand what geometry is, what proportion is. We have to understand what light is. This is really about light. And then you have the unique idea of seeing the heat, right? I mean, that was your conceptual. Were you in school when you made this project?
Yes, I was in school.
Where?
At the GSD.
GSD. So who's your professor?
Alan Syed.
Anyway, I think this is a fantastic project. When did you graduate the GSD?
2017.
So I think Steve, you maybe help her. I mean, I just think there's brilliant work here, but I would try to make it more mysterious. I wouldn't say anything about virtual reality. I mean, it's so boring, I mean, in a way, it didn't pan out either. It's a kind of, I'd like to say that I'd like to introduce your work as post-digital work, right?
That sounds good.
And very painterly and sculptural. You have a good sense of form and shadow. And I think I think you should just try to remove all the cliches and concentrate on your absolutely creative and unique dimensions. I really look forward to what Steve is going to organize in the gallery there, right?
Exactly.
Steve,
Really,
you're curating it, right?
absolutely, 100%. We're very excited. Cathy and I we've been in conversation, I feel like, for several months, and we're discussing apparatus. There's going to be physical events that we looked at briefly in the presentation.
Are you going to have, like,
we'll be there.
Could you have, is it possible to have a mini lecture, like a little mini, like, say, a kind of 4-minute type thing that one could press?
Mm-hmm.
I just would say that the way that you started this talk with the 2 circles, and the way this intersects that, and the way those smoke rings, the pink smoke rings throw the cobalt blue down, I don't know. I think to connect all those dimensions and not say much about it would be really mysteriously beautiful.
It's interesting, Stephen. I like this. Of course, this gets all the juices flowing when it comes to thinking about conceptual art. Some of the various, not just early photography, that's also very interesting. It's almost, scientific. We looked at something like this, which is an apparatus for, almost enhancing vision, kind of observing nature. But you also have, the early experiments when you showed that one slide with the kind of face that was sort of being rolled over a camera. It reminded me of so many things, like, for example, Jasper Johns' body prints, David Hammond's body prints. I was thinking about Bruce Nauman actually quite a bit in terms of his interest and that mystery, the enigma that I think Stephen's referring to as well, that a lot of that generation of conceptual artists were kind of questioning, almost in a dystopic way, the challenges that, about visuality, about race, about, gender, about identity, all of these big, very complex questions, but they were leaving things open for conversation. And I guess one question I had for you is, are we to look at this as optimistic or as pessimistic? Is this a dystopian kind of moment that we're living in? That's sort of, I feel like when I look back at that generation of artists, I think partly why I'm attracted to it is because there's a certain dark energy that they're channeling in the questions that they're raising. And I wonder if that registers at all with you, Cathy, when thinking about these questions.
Yeah. I mean, I think I think I would say I'm trying to be careful about not directly related to dystopian type of work. I think I would like to operate in a way that is adding to kind of the side of the problem. So responding with not necessarily a solution or a kind of an image of, manifesting the problem itself, but trying to critique it using different type of sensible kind of, art or artistic or aesthetic kind of, pieces in digital or in analog ways. So I think a lot of these has kind of, problems that was defined as a background, such as, the COVID kind of situation, or the problems of making, the problems of sharing the atmosphere in the built environment, and all these kind of, crises. But I don't think eventually these provide any either pragmatic solutions or answers to that. And I think it really just adds a way to observe. Just as a way that I think, the essentially the glass, the pair of glasses start to alter. It doesn't really change anything other than the self. So that's my current approach. And I think I will think more what Stephen was talking about and suggesting in terms of staying and trying to push these aspects.
I would like to add, am I turned off?
No, you're on.
I'd just like to add, I think Steve's question is central to all of our work today. You could say that the modern movement was very utopian and it had utopian ambitions. And what happened with the whole rejection and the postmodern was a very negative. And then we developed, and that's when I came to New York, the Institute of Architecture and Urban Studies. And actually there's a recent interview with Peter Eisenman where he says, oh, our work was dystopian. We didn't believe in any utopia. We were dystopic. And I think today, to carry that dystopian, in a way, Raymond Abraham was dystopian, and my close friend Lebbeus Woods was dystopian. But I mean, it's too lazy to say, the planet is on fire, and the tides are rising. In other words, I think what architecture and poetry and great music offer us is another way of looking at life. And that's why I like this work. I like it precisely because it's not trying to be utopian or dystopian. And that's a hard, tight wire to walk. So I hope you can keep doing it. I just think there's a lot of, to me, there's a lot of potential in not being negative, but also not being overly naive, but how you find something poetic the everyday. And I think I think, Steve, that's a great question, because basically we're all faced with that question.
Exactly.
Anyway, sorry, I don't want to dominate.
Yeah, no, 100%. It's also interesting that, when you flashed an image of the Hans Hollein experiment, I thought that was really interesting because it reminded me of, the conversation, again, that generational struggle, questioning kind of where we are, questions of atmosphere. And it reminded me of Stephen, someone we've talked about many times, Walter Piechler.
Yes.
Who was an architect who, and then eventually kind of withdraws and seems to,
I knew both of them, right. And I would say there was a Viennese dystopian strain, in their work, but they bring the level of poetry to the forefront. Right. Therefore, the dystopian does not overwhelm what they're communicating. I mean, for an example, I propose Leonard Cohen. There's a movie currently playing at the Film Forum called Hallelujah, and it's about the 7 years it took him to make that song, and about his last years going around and singing it. And there's something very grateful and poetic and interesting about his example. I don't think he's completely dystopian. I think there's a weird wit and a sense of humor and a joy of life and a gratefulness that's communicable to others. And I think as a troubadour poet, the movie tells about how he struggled as a poet, and he could only, print 200, and he thought that's not a success to be a poet, and I could only print 200 of what I'm trying to say. But in the movie, it shows how he transforms his life and becomes a troubadour, singing his poems. And, we know the rest is history. But I mean, it's around that question of what is utopian, what is dystopian. I think that's a really good question, Steve. I think maybe we could try to put that as a kind of lens. I mean, we have to write a little text for our show that opens on the 3rd of September here. And I'm really looking forward to that show, by the way. I think it's what to me is exciting now at this project that we're doing is to bring completely unknown people. We have 4 architects nobody ever heard of. We're going to make them famous for a day. But I just think that's the most exciting thing that we can do. That's what pamphlet architecture started out trying to do. And by the way, Zaha Hadid in pamphlet architecture in 1981 was the first time her work was ever collected in a single publication.
Yeah, it was a real thrill yesterday to finally handle for the first time that exact issue and to look at it and see.
Yeah, no, I have copies of.
Yeah, to see your copy of all of them. It was a real thrill.
But that's the point. The point. Yeah, the point is to bring people that are really doing original work, bring it forward, and so we can all enjoy it. I'm really excited about these 4 works, and this was to me much more of an intellectual lecture than I even could imagine you would be giving.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very excited about it, but I have a lot of criticism, but I'll keep my mouth shut.
I think that, you know, what's interesting, Stephen, is also, and Cathy, the question of the medium. You know, a lot of this, you know, again, the Hans Hollein, Walter Pichler conversation is an interesting one for me, because you have, you know, two artists, architects working, thinking, asking very big questions. One ends up with a commercial career as an architect, and the other ends up sort of retreating to make art. And so where they had many of the same questions, ultimately, and like Levius and Raymond and all of these other interesting characters, paper architecture into digital architecture of the present, I think these questions all relate. It's like, what is the purpose of these investigations? I guess my question is, exhibition making, in the context, what do you want the viewer to walk away with? What's the message in the medium? You know, is this supposed to be, you know, thought-provoking for, you know, an audience wider than, you know, a group of architects, or is there a general public here? I'm just curious, when, you know, as we go into creating this exhibition, and obviously we have a very diverse audience. This isn't an architecture school, strictly speaking, right? There's, you know, people interested in art. There's people just, you know, casual visitors passing through on a beautiful weekend in the Hudson Valley, etc. Just curious about medium, exhibition making. You know, your thoughts there, Cathy.
I think for me, I'm trying to kind of rediscover the exhibition as a work itself, right? So the some of the design, some of the writing I've been doing for the Vents project, which was essentially an exhibition design, was really kind of about the mode of display and viewing activities.
Could we put that up on the screen? Just curious. So you're reminded. Is there a quick way to go back to that?
Yeah.
This one's important just because there's going to be an element of
probably this one. This one will show.
Yeah,
it's kind of
coming up in the exhibition.
Right. Yeah. So I think I would consider the way that exhibition was designed was part of the relating to the theme of the exhibition itself. And I would hope that it's first it's a spatial aspect, right? So it's an architectural function piece, but also to generate experience that is not just, you know, you look at the work, you read the text and you go away, but kind of the overall multisensorial experience, particular is, you know, created and enabled by the moving mediums. I think, I mean, there's a kind of a long history of this digital media and, you know, how to display media and the role of the media being viewed or being in the environment. And I think there's kind of the sense of, you know, from the early model of the cabinet of curiosity, where you walk around with different proximities to look at the work, it's kind of a typical mode of exhibiting work these days in contemporary shows as well, right? So you establish spatial settings. What I'm trying to kind of explore here is the possibilities, whether or not we can actually activate and alter in a way to invite people to explore on a non-curated path and routes and pre-scripted kind of, you know, images and information. So this is just kind of one particular example. And I think a lot of the play with, you know, the medium hybrids or the use of different media or the misusing of the medium, you know, using them as materials or as spatial columns, for example, in this case, or in some other cases, habitable images. I think they're essentially to kind of really to break away the kind of the conventional way that I would imagine how people will receive message in exhibitions or in kind of media-driven spaces beyond the exhibition, or in, you know, a lot of the contemporary installation with media as part or as the major content.
And as a preview to the show that we're organizing, could you tell us a little bit about how this this installation will be sort of adapted or presented, how you're thinking about it as we go into the show. And we'd love to hear a little bit more about how this connects to the winning pamphlet as well. I'm curious if there's any thoughts there.
But Steve, you're curating the show, right?
Yes, but I want Catty to
She's
tell.
She's not curating the show.
No, I know. I want Catty
to do what you say.
This is more like, I want Catty to prompt Catty to tell us about what we're going to see, because we of course, yes, we're
selecting. As curator, you have to take all this material and choose the things that are going to be in relationship to the other three young architects.
That's right. That's right.
I mean, and by the way, T-Space is a space of natural light. So you're not allowed to put black plastic over all the skylights so you can have a digital, environment. Exactly. I'm sorry. That's not what we, I just want to escape the digital. I don't need, I think that there's going to be a time when everyone will want to just be in natural light and space and have actual materials. We're over digitalized, and certainly the COVID era did that to us. Boy, yesterday when we had our in-person event here out in the landscape, people were so happy to be able to hear the birds and see the sky and smell fresh air and not be looking at a screen, zooming, Right. It was a wonderful moment. And see physical models made out of cast iron and glass and wood. So there's a kind of material, there's a haptic realm of material and experience that you could never do on a digital screen. So, and natural light and moving through space and perspective. Everything is a 2D flat screen. I mean, that's, so anyway, yeah. So, but you're curating the show. You don't ask her how, I don't know. I mean,
no,
you got to have the other three architects.
There is a strong sense of mechanics and mechanical elements or moving objects and electronics that come together that augment our understanding or assist our understanding. It feels like the human body is very limited in certain ways, right? Through your work, it's not a binary thinking about utopia or dystopia, but about going beyond the limitations of our eyes, beyond the limitations of our experience, augmenting it, or over doing all these overlays that assist in a way. Like, I think of each experiment that you're doing as an assisted experience in a way that helps us understand through your eyes with those devices in other dimensions that otherwise we cannot. And I think that this is an important element of the exhibition, the technique, the electronics, the mechanics, not necessarily only the digital, but the coexistence of those in the natural space. That's why I think it works so nice with the natural light in pieces where you have your senses, the light hits your body, and at the same time there is this moving object that passes air that you become hyper aware of through your work. I'm just thinking that when the subject matter changes and you're talking about food systems, for example, very complex elements that are like multi-layered, right? I think even just understanding what a hot air pattern looks like through the candlelight, it's very poetic. It seems very singular, like one experiment that we can get our heads around. But when you start talking about food systems and a completely different scale of operation of those experiments, this is when it's a completely different level of exploration that animals enter the discussion, and then you have multiple pieces of elements that you're tracking, that our bodies in association with the human, with the animal, with the environment, are all in a very complex dance that is very hard to unpack. But I was thinking about the visual perceptions, the J.J. Gibson, maybe that, I don't know if you're, in relating to this book, the ecological perception, the ecological approach to visual perception. So that, because he's also talking about locomotion and other things that, so I think of this as an ecology, as an ecological approach, as a complex,
that's a nice title,
assisted approach. Yes.
That's a nice title. I forgot Irini is also curating Steve and Irene are curating this together. Well, you just said ecological approach to visual perception.
Yeah. That's the
I think
title of J.J. folks. Yeah.
That's the title of what?
J.J. Gibson. J.J. Gibson, Ecological
Yeah,
Approach
right.
to
But
Visual
what about
Perception.
using that? I mean, how do you, okay, I don't know. I mean, maybe, you know, one of the ideas, by the way, when we always have one architecture show, and then if it's good, it travels. Neil Denari's show at T-Space went to like, I don't know, like 5 different venues. There's a gallery in Cleveland that likes to show architecture, and we can retrace that. And you can look that up. But I would hope that we could make this show so interesting that we could travel it to other galleries, right? And anyway, maybe instead of pamphlet 37 for winners, you need a subtitle. And maybe that would help you collate and organize so there could be some strange message of neither dystopian nor utopian, that fine line. There could be a strange subtext to the four, which would help us travel the exhibition to other venues. Anyway, you guys are doing it. I'm not curating it. I'm just a loudmouth talking.
No, that's the big challenge, is how to, in a relatively, specific space. We don't have rooms, right? We don't have, when Laura Potras, we're talking about cinema and exhibition making. I don't know if everyone's familiar with her work. She's world famous documentary filmmaker. She was invited to do an exhibition at the Whitney. And so how does a filmmaker make a physical exhibition? And perhaps some got to see that show a few years ago. But the point is, she had multiple rooms. You could create environments. One of the challenges, Stephen, of integrating work like Cathy's into an exhibition where we're essentially working with natural light, and is to how to give space, give credit to the work while being in context and conversation with teams that are interested in very different things. That's one of the...
Well, that's exactly, but that's why I say that,
yeah,
of course, as she moves on in her career, she'll have her own show. But I mean,
sure,
hopefully in the future. But right now, we would like to introduce these 4 young architects to as many as we could. Therefore, it behooves you and Irene to figure out the conceptual cement
that binds
that
them,
underlies this. And I think this dialogue that we're having right now brought up a couple of ideas, and that is the problem of dystopian, utopian, and that tightrope between them, and then ecological. What was that sentence again of Gideon that Irene had? Irene, what was the title?
Approach, the ecological approach to visual perception.
I think it's an interesting. I think that's an interesting title, and I wonder if that could be a subtitle for the show. Anyway, I just think that's an interesting.
And it's not in Catty's work. It's not just visual. I mean, there is certainly a strong visual component, but also haptics or other senses.
Right. But I mean,
like
I'm just But when you're making something that you want to have a certain, let's say, impression that's memorable, you have to make it somehow coherent. It can work as just pamphlet 37 for new unknown young architects. I think it can work as that. I just wonder if you wouldn't try to.
Yeah, we should. We should try. We had visions and experiments in architecture, so within that bigger umbrella, a series of experiments.
That's not bad. Yeah.
Yeah.
Was that the title of the call, Vision and Experiments?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good title. That's a good enough title.
Yeah.
That's good. Anyway, we should think about how it could travel. That would be nice.
Absolutely. And Stephen, you had a great idea. The idea of doing maybe even that you said something about like a 4-minute video to kind of give a summary to these different projects. One of the challenges is trying to talk about very different approaches to some.
Right.
Yeah.
And that would travel with the show. Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, and And also we could use it, we could use it to promote the show.
Mm-hmm. And just to understand from the larger group, I'm curious, I heard a little bit about how everyone will be able to visit. Is that right? At some point next month? Yasmina, you mentioned something about that. I'm curious. Will we get to see, will everyone on this call?
No, that's the fellowship.
Fellowship.
That's the six that's the six
So
fellowship students that are they're not asking any questions. Where are they?
I know, that's what we need to do next.
Exactly, I was going to pass. I'm curious what our residents think about the work or how they perceive it. Maybe there are some ideas there.
I can ask a question.
Please, thank you, Steve.
So thank you so much for your presentation, and especially for the imagery that you included. It had a very mesmerizing quality. One question that maybe ties together a little bit of some of the other questions is, I work in academia as well, and I'm always, kind of thinking about like, how will what I'm doing be received in the context of how I'm working and where I'm working. And I'm wondering, I was very moved by your choice to carry forward your research onto air in the context of like the meatpacking arena. And I know that work is relatively new. And at the same time, we're moving a little bit out of the pandemic and starting to be able to look back on that as a kind of early historicization or whatever. And I'm just wondering, what reactions have you gotten to that? Because, unfairly, there's a gulf between that particular industry, some of which we sort of looked at and examined in a new light as being of essential work, and what we do, research, art, academia, design. I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Stephen. That's very kind of an important one actually for me, especially with the transitioning from the discovery from using the air as a medium and constructing kind of robotic devices and generating actual kind of air forms to computational setup with turning that into actual measuring tool to evaluate the built environment, architectural typology. So I taught a studio that I did not mention today as part of the talk. I taught a studio that was titled Filters Applied. And it was that was 2 years ago, that was 2000, in the fall of 2020, where we were in a remote situation, everything was kind of hot topic. So we explored with tools, and I had a paper published, if you're interested to look into, it's titled Digital Hot Air. So I was talking about the procedural workflow for a pedagogical experiment. So students were actually envisioning the future scenario, whether we call it dystopia or utopia, a future scenario of a fully automated plants, and try to kind of think about and rethink what CJ Lim has talked about in habitable infrastructure into these specific settings during the pandemic, and foreseeing what the direction of the automation might go, using kind of the air as a partitioning tool. So a lot of work was related both with the small instrument in the kind of experiment to what we might speculate using that. So partially it's imaginary, partially it's kind of scientific. So it's operating between the two realms. So I guess the discussions around that is kind of it's interesting because nobody's really knowing exactly where we are going and what it is all about, because it hasn't been really figured out, right? So everything was kind of exploring. So what I did with the studio and with my own project is really trying to start to look into that potentiality. And I'm not necessarily trying to establish a set of knowledge about food production. I'm more interested in how that tool could adapt to different scenarios, spatial scenarios or systems. So that's kind of one set of the experiments we did. I would say through that there is a diverse set of discussion and questions, but mostly kind of trying to negotiate the invisible impact and the architectural logic. So how we start to think about boundary, for instance.
Actually, we'll mention one quick thing. During this part of the discussion, there was a book. I wondered if anyone had seen it. About 2 years ago, there was a book published by Theo Deutinger called The Handbook of Tyranny. And if you don't know it, I highly recommend it. It's one of the most extraordinary physical and visual books I've seen. And part of what this book is about is
the Handbook of.
It's called The Handbook of Tyranny. It
Of
has this
tyranny.
incredible cover. It's a red cover with the Vitruvian Man kind of in a target. And he basically, the entire book is like an atlas of images of confinement. It talks about relative sizes of prison cells in different parts of the world. It's an incredibly researched book. It also has an entire section about slaughter, and that's actually why. And it's extremely brutal and incredibly beautiful too. Just the amount of visual information was able to condense into images in a book format.
Yeah, I think it's one of the book I mentioned, Timothy Patriot, that every 12 seconds actually reference. Yeah, that he referenced some of the analogy between prison, the confined spaces, and the slaughter. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting. Any other questions from the group?
I have to go. I just want to say thank you very much. This was really very interesting. I'm glad I didn't miss it. Keep going.
Thank you, Stephen. So good to see you.
Bye.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Catty, and for the great, inspiring presentation. Thank you, Steve, for the wonderful conversation and meaningful questions we had and the dialogue that was created. Is there any last question that we have from our residents, maybe? Okay, great. We're very much looking forward to the Pamphlet Architecture Show on September 3rd. I hope everyone can join, and it's going to be a very exciting exhibition. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Catty, again, for your time today. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, and good luck, everyone, with your project.
That's right.
Thank you. Yeah, well,
thank you, Cathy. Thank you, Yasmina. Thank you to Irini, and also thank you to Marissa, who's not on camera but helped us organize.
Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Thank you. We look forward to meeting you, Cathy, and hopefully I'll also get to meet you all of you on the screen at some point. If not this summer, then in the future.
For sure. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. The world is too small. I'm sure we all cross at some point.
That's right.
Our next lecture, for your information, will be on, by Arlene Sheket, Wednesday, July 20th at 11 a.m. New York time. You can find the link. And please make sure you come to T-Space. The doors are open for 2 visitors. Book a tour, and we'll be very happy to have you. Thank you, everyone, and hope everyone have a great day.
Thank you.